everyone. Welcome to the Girl Talk webinar series. Today we'll be doing techniques of effective storytelling through performance and public speaking. I'm Munira Alimire and I'm a sophomore at Stanford University. I'm also a former Girl Up Teen Advisor. And with me is Dani Stoller, an absolute star. Dani is a playwright and actor originally from Brooklyn, New York, and now based in the DC area. Her work's been featured all over, and one of her plays has been streamed digitally through over 24 states and 4 countries. When she's not writing or performing, she's being a complete girl hero and helping women heal disordered eating and body dysmorphia through her company, Set and Sugar. And yeah, today's gonna be a panel. I'm gonna ask Dani a few questions and we'll just discuss things. But the first question I have for you, Dani, is how did you discover your passion for storytelling and get your start in performing?
Well, I always wanted to perform, always. I don't even, how they have that term of bitten by the bug. I don't think that I was even bitten. I just came out pre-bitten. And I always loved to write. And my mother said to me, I hope that no matter what you do, you never stop writing. And so that was always kind of very encouraged. And when other kids would write essays for school, for example, my admittance essay into college was a monologue. So I wrote it as a monologue versus an essay because I just felt much more comfortable expressing myself through theater and through colloquial talking versus making it sound a certain way. Whenever I had to write very, thought out thesis type of work, it always kind of made me nervous because I couldn't really show myself or write how I spoke. And then I went to school for performing arts for both high school and then went for acting for college and fell in love with the DC theater scene because I really liked that there were all these different theaters and all these actors working at all these different theaters and so much work constantly around. I mean, there were small, interesting, independent groups and then huge spaces like the Kennedy Center, and I wanted to work at all of them. And so I came down here. And from there, my writing just I would host little readings with friends, and what I'd written slowly kind of got passed on to people further up this sort of professional theatrical ladder. And from there, I was able to have a few workshops and then world premieres, etc. So it started from birth for me, and now it's just kind of kept going. What about you? Tell me about you and storytelling, Mira.
That's an interesting question because I think that traditionally I wouldn't consider myself a storyteller, but last year my friend and I were having a conversation about organizing and about what roles do people play in activism, and they told me that my my strength is really in narrative building and sharing stories, and I think that my experience in storytelling has really been I view activism and organizing as an opportunity to change people's minds and hearts. And what better way to do that than to tell everyone a story and share with everyone an experience. And quite similar to you, just thinking about what performance is and how do we connect to people. I really tend to think of public speaking in that way. And when I'm speaking at rallies or just I don't know, speaking at different events, I'm really trying to share with everybody my view and the reasons why I stand for the things I stand for through the form of a story. Yeah. But yeah, just an experience, but we can move on to the
Sure.
tips and tricks parts of this. Would you mind sharing a few tips or tricks or techniques for effective storytelling through performance?
Oh, okay. So for me, in terms of, being a writer, obviously there are tangible tricks, which is, consistently keep reading and keep watching shows, etc. But I'm assuming if you do want to get into this, if you're watching this webinar, there's probably a part of you that's already interested in storytelling, that has been inspired to speak, to create. And so much of what that means is actually kind of taking the rules and sort of bending them and bringing the art of storytelling to you and starting where you are. That's the one thing that I will say is a huge tip or a trick, is start where you are. You know, obviously we can be inspired by other writers and other creators and other activists and other public speakers, but none of them are us, and we will never be them. So starting where you are and allowing the form to mold itself to what you want to do with it is super important. It can be very discouraging to feel like you have to fit into a certain space versus seeing what you want to do within this art form and what you want to bring of yourself into this art form. You know, I think that vulnerability is a superpower. I think the best written pieces and the best performances are generally open, they're honest, and they're truthful. You know, a lot of people will be like, that felt so real. And it's not real. It's not a real thing on stage. It's not a real slap, hopefully, you know, but it is honest and it is truthful. And so for me, that's a huge tip, is if you do want to write or you do want to perform or you do want to speak, really dig down deep to what means something to you. Your vulnerability, the parts of yourself that kind of scare you, those are the places to mine, because those are the things that other people are really going to connect to. And then I would say be prepared, which sounds obvious because we want to know our lines, we want to know what we're saying, but it's not just that. It's also being grounded, it's getting present, it's being ready to connect, especially, and I'm sure you know this, Munira, like speaking at rallies. You're not just, you know, speaking. You want to make sure that you're connecting to people at rallies, at places like that. It's call to action. That's why it's activism. So if you're not grounded in a space where you can bring it outside of yourself and help other people join a cause, then really it's not going to land well. And that brings us to the third point, which is it's not really about you. It can feel really good to get all of our emotions on the page. It can feel really good to emote. That can feel awesome. But beyond that, what are we trying to do with our work? What are we trying to say? And in terms of say, who are we trying to give voice to? You know, there are so many disenfranchised people in this country. And even just today, we look at the treatment of certain people in this country, and it can be really scary and really overwhelming. And as a writer, you have an opportunity to give voice to the voiceless. As a storyteller, that is part of the job. What are you trying to say? And it's okay if it's like, you know, a small family comedy. Somebody will get to relate to this story. It's okay if it's something small and tiny and in a very tiny scope, or something huge and grand and dealing with extremely pertinent political public issues. Any of that way is fine. But ask yourself, how does this go beyond me? Who am I speaking to? Who is this for? And just like you were saying, Munira, you know, when you were talking about how you didn't feel like you might be a storyteller, but then you realized that there was a narrative switch, that you were able to kind of work with narrative. Yeah, it's beyond you. This is how we bring people in. This is how we change their minds, is through our work. So whose mind are you trying to change? Or if you're not trying to change a mind, who are you trying to bring comfort to? It's much bigger than just being like, once upon a time, blah, blah, blah. Not that you can't start like that, because if you do, I'm sure it'll be awesome. But that's just, so those are my tips. I hope that makes sense.
Tips, like, wow, they're really good. And they're like,
oh, good, I'm glad.
A lot, like, especially the first one, just thinking about like vulnerability as a superpower. Like, that's something that like just really resonated with me, like deep in my chest, because I feel like, I don't know, like, especially as young women, we're told that like being vulnerable and like being honest about the way you're feeling is a weakness, but it's not. It really is like what drives our work. It's really what empowers us, just knowing that like, hey, we all have this shared experience of like oppression, or of like just like pain, or some kind of like other shared experience of humanity. And it's just like, it's so important to share those feelings and connect with people on that. But do you have anything else to add on to that point of just like vulnerability?
I think that, you know, especially with the work that you're doing, it's when we're calling people to action, you know, there's the idea of like preaching to the choir. We're already getting the people who agree with us fired up. But how do we go beyond that? How do we build empathy in people who might not have known that before? And what I will say is, if you are somebody who is trying to like kind of mess around with convention, writers like Jeremy O. Harris, who really like push the envelope. He wrote An Octoroon and he wrote Slave Play. Really deal with race in an intense way. And he talked about how at a talk back, a white woman was kind of like got very upset. And he talked about how, you know, that this anger at his work might just be kind of like for lack of a better word, a lubricant for discourse, I believe is the phrase he used. And so when you're being an activist and a storytelling activist at that, how do we bring the people in and shake them up a little bit? Because we don't just want to talk to the people who already agree with us. How do we get that empathy from outside? And I think vulnerability is a really great way to say that. We don't act so tough that we block the others out. We open ourselves up so that other people can do the same thing. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that's like what you're doing is really awesome and heroic work, because it's trying to change the world through story very actively, which is really cool.
I feel like, yeah, activism is art, you know, and it's like, I feel like it's most similar to like performance and just like most similar to theater, but we can talk about that some other time. I want to talk about the other two techniques that really like resonated with me as well. Preparation, but more of like, I feel like especially as like young people, we forget how important it is to be ready all the time and to be like ready to hit the ground and do the work. And yeah, I really resonate with that, but I want to talk about like, it's not about you. And I want to look at it from like a different perspective, especially just like organizing and thinking about like you talked a lot about how do you like want to connect to your audience. And I think about it in terms of like, how does your audience connect to you? And thinking about how like, especially like Girl Up and like when we do advocacy for like girls around the world and girls who live in like the global South, our experiences are very different. Like my experience as like a teenager, like going to like Stanford, is so different than like a teenager living in Liberia or like elsewhere. And like just knowing that like your experience and your story is like super valid, and that you're speaking from your own experience, yes, but also knowing that when you do advocacy, it's not just about you. Like it's about knowing that like you might be speaking for somebody right now, but knowing like when to give the mic out and knowing when to like not talk from your own experience. But I would love to hear that from you, and just like how do you balance that and like being a performer and like sharing stories that are not your own story, and just like reckoning around that as well.
Well, that's a huge answer, so I'm going to give a shorter one because I know that we don't have complete time. But when it comes to telling other people's stories and working through that, that's when I think that doing the work and preparation does come back in, because you want to make sure that there is research behind it. So there's the idea of a dramaturg, of somebody who is basically an advocate for your play and makes sure that the story that you want to tell is being told in the correct way. You know, it's a researcher. Obviously, you and I have had different lives. Me and Maggie have had different lives. Everybody that, you know, have been working with me in Girl Up and preparing me for this, we've all had different lives. If I was going to tell a story or a play based on another woman that was completely different from me, I'd have to do some work to make sure that that story was coming across, and it wasn't just some white woman telling a story about something that she thought was interesting to her. We have to be willing to go beyond ourselves if we want to explore other spaces, if we want to use the seat of privilege that we've been given to be offered a stage to talk and share a story. we better be doing justice to the people that we're telling the story of. And that doesn't mean that we should be afraid of exploring places that aren't necessarily easy for us. It means that we have to be willing to do the work and be prepared and make sure that it is outside of us that we're looking to make sure that everything's supported well. And I think that's a really exciting thing for women, especially. I think that girls and women, sorry guys, or men, I think that women are generally better at being able to empathize with one another and see other people and have compassion, even if it's in an abstract way. And so that is where I think storytelling really succeeds, is forcing us to see outside of our own zone and still say, I found myself in that story.
Like that. But yeah, I really get what you mean. And like as we're closing off, like there's just like one more theme that I feel like we both kind of like touched on, but like we didn't really say by name. And I think it's intentionality, and just really being like thoughtful of like, who are you telling the story for? How are you going to tell the story? Like Dani, we only have a few minutes left, but do you want to talk about intentionality?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, I mean, that goes back to what you were saying about, how you're trying to connect to your audience. I mean, in terms of storytelling, so whenever and if you're ever performing at all, or ever acting or anything like that, you're asked like that question, what is your intention? And the idea of what is your intention, like that goes so beyond you. I'm not trying to show you I'm a nice person. I'm not trying to whatever. I'm trying to do something for you and to you. I'm trying to excite you, to enlighten you, to light you on fire. And so it's that same sort of idea. What is your intention with the other person? When you are speaking to a huge group of people, what are you trying to get from them? What are you trying to bring in them? Obviously, you as an activist have never been somebody who's like, I'm just going to talk and like hope they listen. Like no rally would ever succeed that way. You know what I mean? So, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, does that make sense?
That makes lots of sense. But with that, our time is unfortunately up. Dani, it was so great talking to you.
Oh my God, this was wonderful.
Yeah, but thank you guys so much for tuning in, and make sure to tune into the other Girl Talk webinars. Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye, Dani.